I've been talking and giving this speech to schools and service clubs and anybody who wants to listen. It is something that must never be forgotten. I have sort of prepared it for myself. I've got some slides I show. I have high points I like to talk. I told Lisa, I says, if you want me to, I could talk for 2 weeks because it was such a horrifying experience to live through that, what they call the Holocaust now. Actually, in Hebrew, you know, we call it Yom HaShoah. Shoah is a lot more appropriate word. The literal translation is the most horrible experience and I can't even remember what it, but the most horrible thing is that could possibly be that happened between 1933 and 1945, not just in Germany, but in all of Europe, although I was born in Germany, so I kind of had first-hand experience how it came about. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce some other people that have honored us, Mr. and Mrs. Lupton. They are visiting from Europe. They happen to be very, it is by coincidence they happen to live in the, what you might call the county seat of the area where I was born. And they are very active in showing honor and remembrance to those that have fallen. They have written books on the subject, and they are active in what they call the, in German it's Stolpersteine. Anybody know German well enough to? But they are paving blocks. They have a book in German as well as in English. Mr. and Mrs. Lupton, who have been in Germany as educators and scientists and so forth for the last, I don't know your complete history, for quite a few years, and they have made themselves, made it a project to show these, or to place these paving blocks, little blocks in every location where a Jewish family lived in their town of Gelnhausen. It is a paving block with a brass plate on top and the name of the person that lived there and when they lived there, and they are doing tremendous work, and I'm not selling the books, I just wanted to show you what they have accomplished, both first in German, but then they translated it into English. And there's a couple of brochures that they have to show what it looks like. They are also being done in various other cities. I'm in contact with a woman in Frankfurt right now who is very active in this thing. I should have asked you if you know Renate Hebauf. She is an author, and she is writing a book about what happened to children that came unaccompanied by parents or anybody else to the United States between 1933 and 1945. Children particularly from Hesse, which is the province from where I was born, and she contacted me through someone. She got my email address, and I gave her as much information as I could. And quite a few of us that came over at the same time. There was a group of 100 that came at the same time I did, and were all those that had very little chance of ever seeing their parents again. The last time I saw my parents, I was 10 years old. People ask me how old I am. I tell them, well, I was born in 1928. You can figure that out for yourselves. But I didn't start to live until June 21st, 1941, when this old tugboat or freighter, whatever it was, from Lisbon docked in New York, and we all got off and we were taken in by American families, and various organizations took care of us. And the organizations were, the idea was that we were not to be placed in homes and have little insulated groups of children that only spoke German or French or whatever they were. We were to be dispersed and be assimilated into American society, and they did a wonderful job. Within 2 months, I was in a foster home in Chicago. I was enrolled in Haugen Elementary School. I was there for 2 years, went to Roosevelt High School, 4 years at Roosevelt. In the 5 years between my age 13 when I arrived and 18, when I became of age, I had not graduated, but I will. But it never occurred. I lived at 4 foster homes. We were difficult children. We were children that for 2.5 years had not been in a family, only in groups. And sometime during our stay in France and the various homes and refugee camps, or whatever you want to call it, we just were self-sufficient. It was almost like a children's society and government, self-governing. We had 2 or 3 adults from various countries, spoke German, French, Russian. We had a vegetable garden where we grew food. We were also lucky. The last one, the hardest part, after the German invasion and after the Germans had taken over most of France, we were in the south of France. They called it Vichy France, but they were still under the supervision of the Gestapo, but the German authorities were not present where we lived. We were very fortunate. This old abandoned chateau in the middle of nowhere, and I'll show a picture later, was in the middle of a chestnut forest. We ate a lot of chestnuts. We had wood. We roasted chestnuts. We had a very sympathetic farmer who, against the law, let us pick up a few gallons of milk in the middle of the night. We took turns walking over there, picking up. Sometimes in the wintertime, it was such that we didn't have enough clothes to wear to go there at 4, 5 in the morning. And several of them stayed in bed, so the other person that went for the milk could wear their clothes. That's toward the end of my stay in Europe, and after that, they picked out the ones, like the organizations that were involved. It's hard to mention, but the ones that really did the job for us was the American Friends Service Committee. Anyone here that belongs to the Quakers, I would like to thank them. If they're not, I would like to remember that. They were the ones that did the paperwork because they were allowed to function in this semi-occupied, you might say, Vichy France. There was an American consulate in Marseille. They did the paperwork. They took 100 of us at a time, walked us through all the paperwork. That's the first time I had ice cream in about 2 years. And it was funny. I wrote a book, you might say, on what the experiences were in detail, and I wrote mostly for my grandchildren, so they would know where I was and how their grandfather came to be, because sometimes they don't know, oh, where were you? Well, this is where I was, read it. And we were in Marseille, and they tried to get us out of France, through Spain, Portugal, into Lisbon, and in Lisbon they had a bunch of tramp freighters that picked up refugees and took them to the United States. All of the Portuguese registry, of course, because Portugal was a neutral country at the time. But these guys went through to get they had to get transit visas. Spain was not very friendly or sympathetic toward Jews, especially Jewish children that wanted to come through. It was for Generalissimo Franco, I think his name was, and they put all kinds of roadblocks in our way. Like, well, we're only open from 2 to 4 on Thursday afternoons, and if you can get them all in here. They try to get a group visa, just mentioning a few things that people did for us. They wanted to get the Quaker people wanted to get a group visa, and they said, no, you have to get an individual visa for each one. So we had to go get pictures taken. Well, it was still wartime, a defeated country. There weren't that many photographers around, but they did have these tourist kiosks on the street corners. You go in there, you get a strip of very bad-looking pictures out of it. Well, they lined us up with their coins, and one by one we had those pictures taken. And then they took it over to well, we are short-handed. We can't type every one of them up. The way the story goes, and I have researched this for the last 50 years, that the people from the Quakers took their secretaries with their typewriters and walked them over to the Spanish consulate with the bribery of some American chocolate and set them down, and their secretaries typed out all the papers, and eventually got through Spain by night. We spent a day in a convent in Madrid, and the only thing I remember about that convent, and nuns were very nice to us, is the smell of olive oil burning. That's what they were cooking with. And then we went by train overnight to Portugal, then we got off and we could take by bus into Lisbon. And all of a sudden we were in a free country for the first time in 2 years. They treated us royally. They took 100 of us out to a resort on the coast, a beautiful spot right on the Mediterranean. And it was the Atlantic, actually, Atlantic Ocean, Portugal. And it would be a children's summer camp, but it was not being used at the time. It was the end of May, 1941. And then they bussed us up to this resort called Estoril. If anybody has ever been to Portugal and is familiar with that, really high class. And I mean, here we were, a bunch of refugee kids. We didn't have anything but tattered clothes to wear. We haven't eaten anything except chestnuts and hand-me-downs and maybe a piece of bread every once in a while. We're sitting at this long table with the white rim and the silver and the crystal, and the waiters were serving us like we were royalty. And then they asked, who eats kosher only? Well, it was some of us that was observant. We got fish, the rest of them got meat. And it was a wonderful experience. And eventually we got on this boat called the Buzino, and we came across and landed in New York. Longest day of the year, June 21st, 1941. There's a gentleman by the name of, let's see, what is his name? I've got it written down here. Michael Chapone. Anybody know him? Read any of his books? Interesting man. He wrote The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And allegedly, one of their younger brothers was supposed to have come by boat from Lisbon that week in the book. I wonder if he knew our story, but his brother was supposed to come from Lisbon to the United States in some boat, and they waited around for that boat to be available. And I said to myself, this guy's got to be reading our book. It's the end of June 1941 that he's writing about. That's the time that we came over. Unfortunately, the book didn't have the happy ending we did. Their boat got torpedoed by the Germans and sank, and he lost his brother, and he had never forgiven the Germans after that, which is easy to do because I haven't either, to be honest with you. People say, well, forgive and forget, you got to be charitable. When you think about what happened in what's now called the Holocaust, it is awful hard to forget and it's awful hard to forgive. Thank you. That's why the Holocaust actually is a misnomer. The Holocaust is a good, clean flame. This was a brutal series of mishandling of human beings. Now, why did it ever happen? People want to know, why was there a Holocaust? What did they have? Why would they go so far against the Jews? Well, it has a lot to do with it. Society, from hundreds of years, has had the same kind of happenings. It happened when the slave traders went over to Africa, grabbed them from their villages, threw them in the hold of some ship and sold them to the plantation owners in the South. I'm not condemning him, I'm just saying this is an example of what can happen. After the Civil War, when the railroads got the permission and the government approval to build their trains across country and open up the west after west of the Mississippi after the Civil War, there were so many people, soldiers that were without homes that went west to make their fortune. Well, the Native Americans, of course, kind of resented it. They didn't like it. They didn't want the white men come in and build these streaks of steel and gouging smoke and building villages and taking over their land, walked in, well, this is our land. So they started a fight. Well, the railroads had an answer to that. They hired marksmen to kill the buffalo, kill their source of food and shelter or whatever else they used the buffalo for. 200 million buffaloes were killed for no good reason and left in heaps out in the prairie. Well, it's another one of those happenings in history that was uncalled for and brutal. The Crusades, the Genghis Khan, whatever the old people did in those days, and even today, this group in Middle East that wants to take over anybody that doesn't believe like they do, just line them up and kill them. Mass graves. Well, this happened in Germany, but why did they? Of course, the Germans did it in a scientific manner. Why did it come about? Well, it was World War I. World War I, all those countries in Europe, they were all related. They were nothing but cousins and jealous of each other, whether it was the Emperor in Austria-Hungary or the Tsar in Russia or the Queen or King or whoever it was in England at the time, the King in Italy. And they were all trying to, since we got into the industrial era with steamships, they all wanted to take a piece of the lands in Africa where the richest were, the diamonds, the gold, and they were fighting with one another over everything. And one day, one of the relatives got assassinated down in Yugoslavia, and everybody got up in arms, and they declared war against each other. First thing you know, exactly how or what timeline was, I haven't researched, but they were all at war with one another. It was Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, England. The Germans were fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. They were fighting the French on the Western Front. Well, then came the Russian Revolution. The communists took over and decided to quit fighting. And all the German troops were taken out of Russia and taken to the Western Front, and they were really beating the French and the Belgians. Except the Germans made one big mistake. They made several big mistakes. England wasn't as industrial as the United States, or not as industrial as Germany. They didn't produce the weapons like they could have used. So they bought them from the United States. And the United States, being neutral, but still being able, didn't mind selling to the warring factions, sent ships loaded with weapons and machinery and ammunition over to England. And then the Germans made a big mistake. They had invented, or let's say, refined U-boats. They started sinking Allied ships, and they made the big mistake of sinking passenger ships, particularly one that had a lot of people on it. Was 1917, 1,200 people drowned, a lot of them Americans. Well, that's when the American public kind of turned against Germany, because that was a brutal way of fighting a war, both above the sea, under the sea. But most of the war was going on in France and Italy, or in France and Belgium, rather than Holland. And Germany itself didn't really have much of a war scene. But they got alongside the United States. The conquerors declared war against Germany. And here we come with General Pershing with his army. And we had nothing but a bunch of fighting guys that had been living with weapons all their lives, just like today. They were marksmen, they knew how to shoot, they knew how to live outdoors. There was a lot different type of person that came over there as part of Pershing's army. And the Germans never had a chance after that. You bring in a few 100,000 men who just loved to target shoot. I mean, Sergeant York was a good example. They did a nice job in that movie when, who was it, Gary Cooper, I think he's the one who played the part. And it is very realistic. these guys just knew how to shoot properly without having to go through a lot of training. And there was no contest after that. A year and a half later, the Germans gave up. Armistice was declared. My father happened to be a German soldier. Will?
Oh,
Thank you. This was my father as a German soldier in World War I. Both he and 4 of his brothers, as well as 2 of my mother's brothers, were in the war. So we were part of it. I mean, the Jewish population were German more than they were Jewish. They were Germans first and Jewish later. The culture, the diets, the attitudes, this language was not what you might consider a prototype Jew from what a lot of people visualize people from Eastern Europe were, which I'm sure many of you were your ancestors. But the German Jews were Germans of the Jewish religion. And they were part of the German government, part of the German culture, the way we lived, the way we ate, the way we talked. We never knew Yiddish. We never knew any other language. Just we learned Hebrew because we had to read it, but that's all. So anyhow, one of my uncles was killed in the war, sacrificed World War I. And after the war ended, there was a lot of anger in Germany because they lost the war. Well, President Wilson and the other heads of the state from the winning countries got together and they formed a League of Nations to end all wars, they said. The war to end all wars, and they were going to make sure that everything was right. Well, as President Wilson came back to the United States, we presented the Senate with this agreement, which has to be okayed by the Senate today, forever. It's in our Constitution. Well, the Senate rejected it. They didn't want any part of the League of Nations. The United States had fought a war not long before in the Philippines, the Spanish-American War. They were fought in Cuba. They had skirmishes along the Mexican front. They had lost men, sending them over to France, pulled the English and French irons out of the fire. They said, okay, we did it for you, now leave us alone. Isolationism was starting to take hold in the United States, and the public sentiment was, let Europe do its own thing. We have nothing to do with them anymore. We did our part. They should thank us, but leave us be. We don't want to be part of the League of Nations and have to finance somebody else's restitution. So anyhow, France and England, Belgium, who had suffered the most during the war, they got together when the United States wasn't part of it, and they were going to get even with the Germans. They wanted restitutions. They put all kinds of conditions on the Germans after the war because the Germans were the aggressors to start with, it looked like, or at least they took a lot more casualties. France and Belgium, like I said, had been the main theaters of operation. So they put all kinds of restitutions on the Germans. You have to pay this, you have to pay that. No German troops were allowed west of the Rhine River. There was a very limited number of ships they could have, very limited number of airplanes they could have, and that was fine, except for the Germans. They kind of resented it, and there was unemployment was terrible. Inflation was worse. You couldn't buy a piece of bread for less than 10,000 mark or something like that. They just took a piece of paper money and printed a new number over it, and it didn't mean anything because you couldn't buy any more with it anyhow. We were fortunate where I lived. We lived in a little village, 400 people, and it's called Hallstein, in the Central Valley between Frankfurt and Fulda toward the east. And my father was a farmer. After he got out of the army and recovered from his wound, he went on farming. His brother had died. He took over some of the duties. We had orchards. We had fields. We grew potatoes. My mother had a huge vegetable garden. And we also had a little convenience store on the side where we traded with the people that lived in the village. 400 people, there's not very many inhabitants, not much, no paved roads going through there. It was strictly gravel, but we did have a railroad. A little train chucked up the valley in the morning and came back down at night, and that was the only transportation, public transportation, that we had. We did get mail, and the mail brought the newspaper. Well, after the war, there was these young, unemployed German soldiers from the war that started to agitate that something needs to be done. We can't live like this. They were not enough food, the money was worthless, and this one fellow, he was louder than the rest of them, and he had a couple of hangers-on. He says, well, you know, let's get rid of these strangers here. These Jews, they're not really Germans, they're different. That's probably their fault. And then there was a rumor around the Jews through the war, so that's why Germany lost it, because the Jews were sabotaging the German army, which of course wasn't true. I mean, I lost an uncle, I had a wounded father, and I know what other relatives of mine did. I think it was another uncle had lost a leg, he was walking with a cane. But he started getting raunchy and louder, and because so many of them were unemployed, and he promised them that things are going to be better as soon as we get rid of these strangers amongst us. And they formed a party and called it the National Socialist Labour Party. In German, that's Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. And if you take the first two syllables of the word National, what do you got? You got Nazi. And that's what they were called, the Nazis, except they didn't like it. They just like to use the initials, the NSDAP. So anyhow, they got growing and growing and promised everybody in the world, you vote for us, and they formed a party and got into politics, and we will make things better. All we have to do is get rid of the strangers and then make Germany great again. Why does that sound familiar nowadays? Without getting into politics. But let's face it, the United States Constitution says politics and religion shouldn't merge, shouldn't have anything to do with one another, but it doesn't work that way. Religion and politics go hand in hand. There's too often religion has a lot to do with the politics. And politics and they just use the religion as an excuse for their politics a lot of times. Well, that's what happened there. Let's get rid of the Jews, they said. Get rid of these strangers amongst us. Well, we're not strangers. If you see the sign that was on there before, that was from the, can you reverse one, Will?
Reverse it.
It says, this was a Jewish cemetery for the region, established in
79.
79.
1607. Anyhow, families lived there from the 1600s on, right after the 30-year war, which was a religious war too, in Europe.
Please use the mic. Use the microphone.
Okay, use the microphone? Oh, okay, thank you. The 30-year war was a religious war between what was turning into Catholics after Martin Luther proclaimed the Protestantism and the Protestant states. And it lasted for 30 years and devastated the countryside. And most of the Jews at the time were restricted back 400 years back to the cities. They could not own land. The nobility recognized the Jews for having been the slaves of the Romans, and that's how they got to be in Germany in the first place. When the Romans retreated back 2,000 years back, they left their slaves behind, and the Jews just established themselves as shopkeepers and traders and what have you. They were the intellectuals because they could read, and most of the people in the countryside could not read or write. So anyhow, the Jews were restricted by the nobility. Well, after the 30-year war, these little towns were all a little devastated because the armies had gone back and forth. So about that time, back in the 1600s, some of the nobility went into the cities and made very attractive offers to Jewish businessmen. Come on out to the countryside, come on out to Hallstein or Gelnhausen or Fulda or whatever town needs a little bit of economic know-how and establish some businesses that provide jobs. There was another big war there, and that happened. They gave them some land they could have, and that's where my family got the nice piece of land that we have. And they called them Schutzjuden. That means protected Jews. They were protected from any kind of discrimination by the rest of the discrimination because they were working for the, for nobility. So that's where the Jews originally based. So we're not strangers. We've been there for hundreds of years. We had established businesses, paid our taxes. That is my forefathers. I personally didn't. But that's what Jews were doing in all these little villages. And every one of those little villages around what was called Hessen, or this particular county called, at that time it was called the Kreis Gelnhausen, Kreis being county, circuit. And each one had several Jewish families. There were 6 Jewish families where we lived, out of 400 inhabitants. We had a tiny synagogue. My father more or less was the lay leader of the synagogue, and after a while he was the only one that was still maintaining it. But all the other towns around there had their own Jewish population. So these people come along and they say, let's go to the strangers. Well, we weren't strangers. But when things were tough, the economy was in the dumps, and they wanted to believe in it. The old saying was true. Hitler surrounded himself with these guys that knew how to manipulate people, like a guy by the name of Joseph Goebbels. He was the press agent or manipulator or spin doctor. And the saying is that if you tell a big enough lie often enough and repeat it, pretty soon people will believe it. Well, it's got to be true. I saw it in the paper. Of course, they started to control the paper, but they got into this politics, and first thing you know, they started getting more and more votes. A guy by the name of Hindenburg, who was a big military leader during the war, he was elected president, but the guy was old and he was tired. And because Hitler was the second most votes at that time, in 1932, he appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany, which is the same as Prime Minister, which means Hitler ran the country, and Hindenburg was just a figurehead. And that is when it started. Once he got into the parliament, then he manipulated the parliament. And there is many, many things. I like to go through a list of dates and happenings progressively as they happened from 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. By March 5th, 5 weeks later, anti-Jewish laws were passed by the parliament. He had the majority. And 2 weeks later, parliament empowered Hitler to pass laws by just saying so. He didn't need a vote of the parliament anymore. Then they had a boycott against Jewish businesses through the public in April. And then non-Aryan officials are removed from office, which means no Jew could hold a public office. The mayor of Frankfurt was a Jew. He put his letter of resignation on the table, packed his bags, and left the country. This is what they wanted. They wanted us to leave. Get them out of the country. They didn't care where we went. The ones that didn't want to leave, well, they took care of it later on. Well, my father, this was going on through the next several years. By a year later, they removed all Jewish children from public schools. I had been at one year, first grade, 1934. And after that, we sat at home, my sister and I. We played a lot of rummy. I was a teacher in a little house, little town A few miles up the road, by the railroad, he gathered a lot of Jewish children around and started giving us some lessons. He could not teach because he was a Jew. He was removed from office too. So we went up there by train every morning and came home every night. My father didn't have any more money. Business had gone south, but we had a cow, so we brought a bucket of milk up there. Milk was a good way of trading, and all the kids had some milk for lunch. Well, it was good for a couple of years, and then this teacher, he emigrated, he left the country too, and we were back out in the middle of nowhere again. And once again, we were just sitting there and not doing much of anything. And then the Germans started passing all kinds of rules. We were forbidden of slaughtering ritually. We couldn't have any kosher meat. Public schools, well, about that time, 1933, there was about 500,000 Jews in Germany. Undesirables can lose their German citizenship. That means Jews lost their citizenship, of course, couldn't vote anymore. Then President Hindenburg died. It was in 1934, and Hitler just assumed the power. He was chancellor. He says, I'll just take over the office of president. And nobody argued with him. In the meantime, for some mysterious reason, the Parliament building burned. They blamed the communists from Russia that wanted to take over Germany. And since then, the theory is the communists didn't burn down what they call the Reichstag, the Parliament building. The Germans did it themselves to blame somebody and dissolve Parliament, and then just the head of the country was in full charge without anybody questioning him or his cronies. Hitler was the figurehead, but he was not really the complete, total architect of this. He had a bunch of people around him that had to be the ones that gave him all these ideas. Just like every other political figure has to have someone that tells him what laws or what rules to pass. Like, he declared himself head of the government and gave himself the title of Führer, leader. And then, of course, was the personal tribute to him. The accepted greeting in Germany was Heil Hitler, which means Hail Hitler, whatever that means. And then the sale of Jewish publications is prohibited. No more newspapers, magazines, or anything printed by Jews. And that was in September of 1935. Then they passed more laws. Jews lose their German citizenship completely. Jews are prohibited from marrying German citizens. Jews are not allowed to employ German citizens under 35 years of age. We might violate some German rule. All Jewish public servants are discharged, even if the ones that were street sweepers, they were gone by then too. They didn't have any jobs in Germany anymore. Of course, the voting rights were gone when you lost your citizenship. And then by that time in 1936, Hitler and his government had rearmed themselves against all regulations that the British and French imposed on them after the war. And the French and the British did nothing about it. They built tanks, they built airplanes, and then in 1936 they marched across the bridges into the Rhineland and reoccupied the area west of the Rhine, even though they were told by the Armistice Agreement they weren't supposed to, but they did. And nothing was done about it. That's what they felt like, oh boy, they are a bunch of cowards. We're not going to be worried about what they're going to think of us. Then, of course, even the universities had to restrict their Jewish student numbers. Jews were only issued passports to leave the country. I have my passport. This is a picture of my passport. It has a great big Jew on it, J on it for Jew. And it's written across the top, for immigration to France. That's as far as it go. Picture and stamps and everything. And it was my passport to leave the country. Well, by that time, my father had this bright idea. It's nothing but a political thing. I am a good German citizen. I was wounded in the war. They're not going to touch a wounded war veteran. He was wrong, unfortunately. So was every other Jewish war veteran. And then in 1938, the German troops entered Austria, what they call the Anschluss, the annexation. They said, well, there's so many German-speaking people in Austria, it was the country of the language of the country. And they entered, and there was enough people in Austria that felt the same way as the Nazis did, and they welcomed them. And after that, the Jews had to report all their assets. Jews are prohibited from pursuing certain professions: travel agents, tourist guides, brokers, among others, bankers. As of January 1st, 1939, Jews must carry identity cards on their person at all times. Then Jewish physicians lost their licenses. They were just known as medical assistants, medical attendants. Jewish-sounding street names were replaced by German-sounding street names. After that, Jews may only have Jewish first names. My name was Eric. Oh, that's a German name. So I had to assume a middle name of Israel. I was known as Erich Israel Greenebaum. After that, every Jewish male had to have the middle name of Israel. The Jewish women, girls, Sarah. My sister would be known as Johanna Sarah Greenebaum. It was Jewish sounding. About 17,000 Jews of Eastern ancestry were expelled by the German-Jewish border, German-Polish border, and they were trapped in no man's land for 6 weeks in October of 1938. And there was a young man by the name of Herschel Greenspan, whose parents lived in Hanover and had a business, and he was outraged. He, of course, could not go to school in Germany anymore, so they sent him to France to get an education. He was in Paris, and at 17-year-old, he got himself a gun someplace. I guess you can if you have the money. And he marched into the German embassy, and he was going to kill the German ambassador, you know. Of course, the first guy he meets is not the ambassador. He met a young German military attaché. Well, he shot him instead, killed him. And that is the nail that sealed the coffin for the last time. It was all beforehand. The scenario was there in place. They say the outrageous, spontaneous, how do they call it? Well, they call it a spontaneous demonstration against the Jews. And it wasn't spontaneous, it had been planned. They were just waiting for the right moment, for the right excuse. And this guy gave it to them, which was a dumb thing to do, of course. And in the middle of the night on November 8th, 1938, 1,200 synagogues were burned at once. Jewish businesses were entered. There were show windows smashed, merchandise thrown in the street. Jewish homes, especially the ones in the cities and apartments upstairs, were entered, and all the good crystal and dishes and glassware, everything thrown out the window, out onto the street. And that's why it was called Kristallnacht, the night of crystal, the night of the broken glass. And that was the beginning of the end. In the meantime, they had also devised some very systematic ways of persecuting the Jews other ways. Like, they set up a timetable where every town had to have a date for when it was cleansed of Jews. Judenfrei, they called it. each one had their own little date. In Hellstein, it happened to be in April 1938. My parents had a sellout, forced sale, given to a family who had been displaced when the Germans built new military facilities. So it was easy, just give it to the Jews. I don't know what they paid my parents, if anything, but I got very little restitution of it back in 1950. But it was a beautiful piece of land. It's still there. Big house, big orchard in the back. But anyhow, my parents had to leave. Packed everything up, moved to Frankfurt. They were employed by the Jewish community in a Jewish old people's home, rest home, as caretakers. Now here's my father. He was a farmer. He was a man of the country, fresh air, land, apples, potato fields. Here he had to work in the bottom of a rest home, stoking the furnace, sweeping the floors. What a come down. But it was someplace to be. In the meantime, this thing happened in 1938. We were living with my uncle in Speyer, who was a teacher, and he had also gathered as many Jewish children as possible to give them some kind of an education. And we had moved there about a year before. He lived in Speyer am Rhein, and the synagogue was where we held our education. My uncle Sigmund taught Jewish children, because he, as a Jew, of course, couldn't teach anymore in the public schools, even though he was still employed by the public schools. They paid him, but only to teach Jewish kids. And somewhere the books were still kept. Well, that synagogue was burned, and he was arrested and taken to the concentration camp for safekeeping for the time being. And then the order came out. This city where we lived was on the west bank of the Rhine River. All Jews have to be on the other side of the Rhine by midnight. Here's my aunt with her two sons, and my sister and I had to leave, and her husband was arrested because he was a Jew, and this was definitely the beginning of the end. And that's when my father realized he was not going to make it. But he had a chance, excuse me, he had a chance for my sister and I to get out of the country. My father cashed in his life insurance in Frankfurt, and he financed my sister to get on a transport, and those transports were available by then. You might remember a movie, Into the Arms of Strangers, and it mostly documents when Jewish German children were taken in by British families, and they called them children's transports, and in groups of how many, I don't know. But the same thing happened in Holland. Queen Wilhelmina herself guaranteed their welfare. It happened in Switzerland. One of my cousins went to Basel, and also they had organized by then groups of children to come to France, underwritten by the Rothschild family. They financed it, an organization called Union OSE, which stands for Security of Children or something, and organization. And they organized the groups of children. There were 50 children in each group from 5 different cities. That's the particular movement. And there would be 250 kids came into France in March 1939. I was in the hospital in Frankfurt with infectious disease. My aunt, whose husband was the one that was the teacher, and she was very active in the Jewish community and organized these things, and then she organized the last one, and she was going to go as adult escort, and she said she isn't going to come back. That's her way of leaving Germany. So, but she wanted me to be in with them. I said, I was her nephew. My parents had not made arrangements for me to get there, but my father had the money, And she went to the hospital and told the hospital superintendent, "You've got to discharge that boy and get him out of this hospital, or you will be responsible for him not living." So they discharged me early. I was fine, I guess, I don't know. I made it. I passed the physicals that they required to get on these transports, and I was on a group of 50 kids that went to France on March 8, 1939. And a lot of them were from Frankfurt. Well, this whole group was from Frankfurt. There was from Frankfurt, from Saarbrücken, from Vienna, and a couple of other cities. So the total 250, organized by this organization, financed by the Rothschild family. We were quarantined at the Rothschild Hospital in Paris for a week to make sure nobody had any bad illnesses. And then they distributed us to these various children's homes. First in Paris, and then after the war broke out, they moved us south, and this is a place that would you like to advance a few of those films? Yeah. I'll kind of explain what we're going to be looking at here. All right, this was the house where I lived, where my parents lived, and that was built by my great-grandfather about 1860 for his two sons. And you see that stairs goes from both sides. That's a duplex. On the right side was my Uncle Moses. On the left side, my grandfather Jacob. They're brothers. And it's still a divided house today, owned by two different people. That was before I was born, and I think it might have been before my parents were married. Their marriage, by the way, was an arranged marriage, and my mother did not have a hard, easy time of it. This is the house on our side, the way it looked in the old days. I'll have like up there some places, the bedrooms where I was born. Yes, that was my parents' bedroom. Of course, nobody went to the hospital in those days to get born. You were all born at home. On a stormy July night, 4 a.m. on a Sabbath. Makes me a Shabbos kid, if you know what I mean. Hey, thanks. This was my sister and I when we were children, sitting in our backyard. It was me in this little chair. That's her. She's 2.5 years older than I at that time. Cute little kids. And that was me about 4 or 5 years old. I'm in the backyard with my little toy wagon. It was a happy childhood, really. Everybody tells me I'm sucking my thumb. I didn't. I was eating a pear. Thanks, Bill. This is the schoolhouse in Hallstein, where we went to school. On the right side was the school. On the left side was the county, or the city offices, I guess. And upstairs where the teacher lived. The town provided all that. And that was us. After 1 year of school, they took our picture, like they do at the end of the school year. 1934, yes. 35. Started in 34, 1935 is when picture was taken. We called, my sister's name was Hani. Her name was Johanna. We called her Hani, which is a nickname. My mother came from Bavaria with a different dialect. She called her Hanala, whatever. And that is the family. My father, mother, myself, goofy little kid there, and Hani, my sister. And that's probably about 1937. I had an uncle. He was a big photographer. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have any pictures. Every picture we had basically came from my uncle Isidore. He and my other uncle Gustav, they were traveling salesmen. My mother's family, in their day, they were vintners. They had vineyards, a winery, made wine. The basement was loaded with casks, a whole row of casks of wine. Whenever it was time to bottle wines, my grandmother made up a big tub of starch that they used for glue and paste the labels on. He had his own label, Louis Royal. What that means, I don't know. But my grandfather, he sold a lot of wine. His two sons, when they were grown up, they traveled the country selling their wine, obviously. They did well because both of them saw the handwriting on the wall and made arrangements to leave the country. My Uncle Isidore went to Indianapolis. My Uncle Gustav took some time in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, and then he joined his brother in Indianapolis. But grandfather, he didn't leave the country. His wife was ill. It was not something he wanted to do. He stayed there behind. And eventually he wound up in Theresienstadt, the holding camp where they was supposed to have been like a country club. Don't believe it. Now this is the little train that we had to take every day when I went to the next village to get the little education we got for a couple of years from a Jewish teacher. It went up this valley in the morning. There was no place to turn it around, so they just came backwards in the afternoon. But we, as Jewish children, riding that thing to go to school, we had to stand on the rear platform of the last car. I mean, that was one of the requirements, or we would have been kicked off. So we went with our little can of milk to go up to the Hellstein. And that was good for a few years. And that was the only transportation we really had outside of the gravel road that came from the main highway about 2 miles to the west. Now everything is paved. Yes or no? This is my mother's family. Grandmother and grandfather always sat. The pictures were taken in front of their house, in front of the winery. And there is Uncle Isidore on the left. I think that's him. No, the lady on the extreme left, that's my Aunt Bertha. And then her brother Issy, and then Issy's wife Fanny. And beyond that is my Aunt Ruth. She eventually went to Holland. And Uncle Gus, and in the front, that's me, and my cousin Eva. I don't know where Honey was that day. Eva, by the way, is one of the few of us that are still around that came from the family that was born in Germany. In fact, she and I are the only two. She is 85, and she taught school in Kettering, Ohio until she was 80 years old. Another survivor. Thank you. Another family group. That one is a little small. It was a big family. There were 9 kids in my grandfather's family, my father's brothers and sisters. There were 6 kids in my mother's family. Now this is a group picture of a day camp in 1937, I believe it is. In Frankfurt, when we couldn't go to school and we had no place to go. My father made arrangements for us to join the local orphanage that had these day outings, and it's quite a picture because there's so many of them were in that group that came out of Germany with me from that orphanage. My sister, I'll point out to her. This was my sister, and I'm down here someplace. This girl's Elfrida. She's living in San Diego. She's 90 years old now. She was a good friend of my sister's. They were the same age. About 10 or 12 of them were in the same group that I came out of Germany with. And many of us lived together, and one by one, unfortunately, nobody is immortal. I've lost a few people over the years. I'd like to just memorialize some of them. There was Henry Schuster, he was probably the oldest, and him I know longer than anybody. I was about 8 years old when I got to know him. Elfrida Schloss, she's still living in San Diego, but the one that died, trying to think of the names. Well, we've lost a few friends, but the ones that I mentioned, we all lived into our 80s, and I'm getting up there too. But that was a group that made the rounds back in, 25, 30 years ago, when we had a reunion. And everybody got a copy of it, which was nice to have. All I remember about that day camp is that the honeybees, yellow jackets rather, they were flying all through the tents where we had our sweet drinks and everything. By the way, I didn't mention it, one of the rules that they imposed on all the Jewish people is they had to wear the star. I'm sure everybody's heard of it, but this is a sample of what it was like. They had to wear them. And they had all kinds of insignia. They had insignias for every unwelcome person. Whether it was for gays, for foreigners, for Jews, for other religions. There weren't that many other religions. I don't think they picked on the Catholics as much. They couldn't. There would have been too much of a outcry, even though there was only one Catholic person in the village where we lived. But Catholicism in Germany was still prominent enough that they were very careful in how many toes they stepped on. What's next, Bill? Okay, when I came to the United States, envelopes would look like with all kinds of stamps, and there were sets of every piece of mail was opened, coming and going for Jews. Thanks, Bill. That's what the back of it looked like. They had to put everything in. Who took it to the post office? Because my parents were not allowed to go on the street. They had to tell who was going to take it to the post office, where it goes to, where they came from. Then it was opened, just opened. And of course the swastika stamp on it. And I don't know what was so wonderful about reading those letters. I have 11 letters that I had photocopied in the meantime, and I donated them to a museum in Chicago, the Holocaust Museum. Those letters are now 75, almost 80, 76 years old. And it shows how my parents felt. They had to put everything in code, couched language, you might call it. Yes, Uncle such and such, he's still the way he always was. They couldn't say he's dead. They couldn't say that he was in a concentration camp or that he'd been arrested or that he was sick. Martha is still working. Whoever Martha was, probably her cousin. Anyhow, that's what the envelopes looked like, and I just thought I'd put a little sample on there so people see what the rigmarole they ran through the what's the word? They were so paranoid about everybody. They had a scientific way of treating the Jews, little by little. Over a period of years, I have this list of things. Jews may not use public telephones. Jews must wear a Jewish star on their clothing. That's for September 1st, 1941. Oh, Jews may only refer to themselves as unbelievers. They can't say, I'm a Jew, I'm an unbeliever. Jews may no longer have telephones. First German Jews are deported in February 1940. Jews may receive no more ration cards for clothing. Jews must turn over all radios to police. No, as things went on, I think they sat around every night and said, what can we do next? Then they had a conference after the United States ended the war. They knew nobody was going to leave for the US anymore or anywhere else in the world. Then they had this conference outside of Berlin. Jewish handicapped may no longer wear anything which will identify them as being handicapped, could not have a walking stick, could not have any kind of appliance. I don't know about eyeglasses, but I don't think they could get new ones. So there's a story of a guy at a police station, he dropped his glasses, the guy reached down to get it, and the cop stepped on it and he said, don't worry about them glasses, you don't need them where you're going. Told him something. Jews may not have newspapers, magazines, no fur garments. Jews must give up all wool clothing that was needed for the army. In 1942 is when they had what they called a Wannsee conference, and they had this dilemma, what are we going to do with all the Jews? And that's when they decided we will have a planned effort, scientific way of exterminating them. That's when they built the concentration camps. The concentration camps were already in existence, but it was just for holding. But then they really decided we have to have a planned, scientific, regulated way to get rid of them. That's when they started loading up the trains, 1,000 at a time, took them to the concentration camps and immediately marched them into the gas chambers. First they had to take off their clothing. The timeline for Frankfurt was September 22nd, 1942. That's when my parents were taken into custody and put on a train and taken to a camp called Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. They loved having those death camps in other countries. So although Germany had enough concentration camps, but it was not a real extermination camp. It wasn't like you exterminate a swarm of locusts. No, they did that in the old countries. First, they picked out the ones that could work, and preferably between 15 and 25. Anybody over that, they didn't need. There was enough young people. My sister lived in Holland. She went to Holland in 1938 in December on a children's transport, and she stayed in orphanages or children's homes. And then after the Germans invaded Holland in 1940, they eventually picked up all the Jews that were there. And everybody knows about Anne Frank. She was contemporary of my sister's. They weren't hiding. My sister was taken into camp in Holland, and they had a special section for young people. And one day, and I was talking to a boy named Moishe Frank. Moishe Frank was a cousin of Anne's. He was in the camp too, Westerfort, and he went over the wall with some friends of his. He says the other two got killed. He got away. He joined the underground and eventually wound up in Israel. And I talked to him Last time I was in Germany, it was 1996. And he gave me a story. He says, well, I don't know your sister personally as such, but she was probably part of the whole group that was put together. And one day, a very educated sounding German gentleman came in, got them all together and says, now, here, young people, you are all bright young people and you are all of German descent. And you were born in Germany, but you are here because your religion is not allowed in Germany. But now that we run Holland, this was after Holland gave up, now that we run Holland, your religion is no longer legal in Holland either, so you might as well cooperate with us, and you won't be sorry. We need people to go to work for us back east in the war effort, and if you go voluntarily, you'll be well treated. And he sounded so convincing. And according to Washington, he says he didn't believe a word. That's why he and his buddies escaped. And he got away. But my sister, amongst all the others, said, sounds good, let's go. So they went and got on this train and were taken to Auschwitz. I have tell you something about somebody. By the way, I have this thing that I would like to everybody to remember. It's a quote by Church Santayana, and you probably all heard it. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. There are too many people that feel that history is not worth saving. I wrote up my little book here, 140 pages of until I came to the United States. And I just made about 25 copies for my family and grandkids and anybody who wants in museums. And I had somebody in the family, educated woman who had been married into a family. I said, what do you think? Want to read some of it? Oh, there's way too much history in that. He says, way too much history. It is history. Well, you don't need to tell people all that nonsense. I said, okay, if you think it's nonsense, you should live through it sometime. So anyhow, she thought it was too much history. A lot of other people, I think the same thing. It's 140 pages of history. It is history. It's what happened in 1933 to 1945 to me and to millions of other people. A gentleman by the name of Dan Aaron. Name mean anything, anybody? Dan Aaron. His family lived in Frankfurt. His father was an attorney, very educated, very prominent, wealthy, good family. Dan, I think, was about 6 or 7 years old when they got out of Germany. He saw the handwriting on the wall, his father. They came to the United States, they lived in New Jersey. Now, what's a German attorney going to do in New Jersey in the late 1930s? Very little. The man was very despondent. And one day he hung himself, committed suicide. Out of this, it happened in many places. There were a lot of suicides among refugees as well as the ones in a concentration camp. They saw no hope. Dan Aaron, the father should have waited. Dan Aaron died a billionaire. Dan Aaron went to work for a family that founded Contrast. He was a real whiz on electrical stuff. And then he went to work and lined up cable companies throughout the South. One by one, the company grew and he became vice president of Comcast. And until he got Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, he went to a home in Pennsylvania and died about 10 years ago. But Dan Aaron is a perfect example of what can be done. We have people in our family, outstanding geniuses. Now here's something to think about. What if the Germans had not persecuted the Jews? What if they had utilized all that talent that was available? Let's face it, I mean, us Jews, we're smart. A lot of us are, because over the period of years, the dumb ones got weeded out by other pogroms and so forth. So it's only let's say, a good strain survived. My cousin, Jack Steinberger, If you would look him up on Google, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics. It was given to him in 1982 for discovering some particles. And he worked on the atom bomb at the University of Chicago. All his brothers, there were 3 brothers, all 3 of them at the University of Chicago. They came out in the 1930s. Their parents were educators in Germany. My uncle Ludwig, he was not a dummy. He and his wife, Bertha, they moved to Chicago, lived in Rogers Park, managed to get some money out, and bought a deli. So they ran a little deli, a little storefront deli. But it wasn't really anything that the guy went to college for, but it was a living, and he put his 2 sons through school. And they got their, I'm sure, scholarships because they were brilliant. Went on to high school in Chicago. It's very well known. University of Chicago, physics, worked on the Atomic Energy Commission with Fermi, I believe it is, the guy was that was involved in those things. Jack is living in, he's 95 now. He's living outside of Geneva, Switzerland. He worked for CERN, the European conglomerate. Richard is nodding his head, you're familiar with it. And he was teaching at the University of Pisa in Italy for a while. But just think of what the talent these people, if they had not spent the money, these trains of 1,000 people each, 4 times a day, do nothing but carry half-dead people into the concentration camps. If they had used those resources to carry the arms into Russia when the Russian army was defeating the Germans at Stalingrad, they could have won the war in Russia. But no, they were so obsessed with getting rid of Jews that they used all their resources to get rid of Jews. And anyhow, Dan Aaron wrote a little essay when he was also doing what I'm doing, going to schools and lecturing. And I have been to many middle schools, and also I was at Fort Lewis last year, and I was asked to go up there and speak and give a history lesson of World War II and what happened. And sort of a tongue-in-cheek essay that Dan wrote years ago, a train ride. Imagine this class of 50 to 100 students. Instead of going on a class field trip, and I put in 9R because this is our school district, instead of a 9R school bus, it was jammed into a cattle car. There was just enough room to sleep standing up. Nazis had rounded you up the night before, banging on the doors of your houses as you slept, demanding that you dress and prepare yourselves for resettlement. You were told to take just the casuals and a few precious personal belongings with you on the local train station for departure. The scene quickly changed. This was no excursion or holiday departure. To your dismay, the train station was filled with cattle cars, not passenger cars. As you proceeded to the platform, you noticed that those ahead of you were being relieved of their luggage and forced into the cattle cars, brought by Nazi stormtroopers with rifles and fierce-looking dogs. On one false step of resistance, and a bullet would find its mark. After leaving the station, you endured the train ride for days, sometimes weeks, destination unknown. Once at your destination, you were told to quickly disembark. Sick, starving, smushed with urine and feces, you arrived at night to be greeted by more howling, barking dogs and screaming stormtroopers. The floodlights of the camp blinded you as the commandant, using his cane, separated you into 2 lines. One for the sick, the weak, the real little ones who could not do any labor. The other line for the strong and fit. As you were looking for your best friend, you were rudely thrown back into line and told to undress for a shower. You found your friend and other members of your class together, while you all went into the shower. You wait for the luxury of a hot shower only to hear the hissing of the diffusing gas from the shower heads. As the poison permeated the entire room, Many of you in a desperate lunge for life clawed your way up the cement walls in a futile attempt to reach fresh air. Your prints can still be seen. Well, he wrote that, what could have happened. And I'm thinking of my sister, put on a train in Westerbork and shipped to Auschwitz. Now this is from Holland all the way through Germany into Poland, where they wanted to have the extermination camps. And from the best of testimony that I've heard, there was no food, there was no water, there was a barrel for relieving yourself, which was emptied periodically, if and when they stopped. Sometimes they would stop for days at a time while the trains were being rerouted or held for more important trains, but there were no comforts, no food, or nothing to relieve the discomfort. Many of the cars arrived at the destination with corpses inside, of course, and then they were taken out and immediately separated and taken to an underground undressing room, and the door on the other side said showers, which of course was not. My sister was on one of those trains. I can imagine she was 16 and a half years old. 16 and a half year old girl going through that. When she was separated, she was picked for some kind of a duty. The rest of them. Now my parents arrived there January 30th, 1943. They were never given a number, which means they were immediately taken into the gas chambers. My mother was 46, my father was 47. He could have done them a lot of good, but no. They were just shunted into the gas chamber, exterminated, the bodies burned. If you ever go to Auschwitz, and I'm sure some of you have been there, you go to the far corner on the right side and see a hill. That used to be a swamp. That hill was filled in with the ashes of the people that were killed. The ones that were put to work, like my sister, were given menial jobs. And the Germans had a formula where the diets were just barely enough to keep someone alive for 6 weeks before they starved to death. I have the date when her train arrived in Auschwitz and the date when she died, 6 weeks, give or take a day. Why do I know when she died? Because the Germans, in their wisdom, kept immaculate records. I walked into I visited Auschwitz because I wanted to know what happened. I asked the guy at the museum at the desk, I says, is there any way to find out if my parents and sister wound up here? He said, oh yeah, he says, go into the archives building. Well, we were there on a Sunday, and he said, well, they're closed today. If you come back tomorrow, you can talk to them. I said, okay. Man spoke English. So the next day, we were staying in a hotel in Krakow. I took a bus. Eileen went shopping. She had seen enough. I took a bus to Auschwitz, got off, went into the archives building, and girl at the desk. And the first thing I asked her, I says, what language do you speak? German, English, French? No German, no German. Spoke a little English. And I says, I'm looking for my parents, my sister, to see if she gave me a piece of paper, name, date of birth, and where were they born. I said, okay, no problem. I wrote down all three of them. It took her about 10 minutes. She came back with 3 file cards. Mama, Papa, Honey. And then another one took my honey's card, went someplace else and came back, would you believe, with a full-page death certificate, signed and filled in by a doctor. I mean, they kept such meticulous records, it's like they were pronounced their own death sentence for being what they were. And so I read my sister's death certificate. She was very good, very cooperative. She made copies for me of all the documents, put them back in their files, and I have the copies here. The cause of death for my sister, general body weakness. Of course, it wasn't German. general body weakness, allgemeine Körperschwäche, if you speak German. So she starved to death, basically, is what it is. And that was the end of my family. My parents were removed from where they had worked in Frankfurt in September when Frankfurt was declared Judenrein or cleansed of Jews. And, I've got a few more pictures, would you please? Thank you. This was one of the signs they had in one of the hotel dining rooms across from the main train station back in the late 30s. And it says, visit by Jews is not allowed. A huge sign right above the door that told us right then. Next. This was the main synagogue in Frankfurt, a place called Bernaplatz. And this was a huge, modern-looking synagogue with a copper dome on top. And when young Greenspan shot the German attaché, and they had this spontaneous outbreak of retaliation and burned all the synagogues. That was the main synagogue in Frankfurt. It was burned. Thanks, Bill. That was me. Once I got to France, that was one of the homes where they put us up. This was the little La Chesnaye. It's, I think it means chestnuts. That particular home was reserved for strictly Orthodox children. There was 3 or 4 different homes. A big one for other ones. Then they had one that was a smaller facility that was for smaller ones, children under 6. Okay, now this is Chateau Montantin. After the fall of France, they pile us onto trains, and signs on all the trains called signs on that for children only. They knew that if the Germans caught up to us, we were nothing but mincemeat. So they loaded us onto these trains, and they used every piece of rolling stock in the French national railways to head south, and all trains were heading south from Paris to what was still not occupied by the Germans. When we got there, it was middle of the night, it was an all-day trip. They had packed us lunches and everything. We got our personal belongings, and then we had a walk. And we walked down the long country road, big trees on both sides, till we came to this place, Villa La Chesnaye. It was completely deserted except for one piece of furniture that the previous owner, well, he still owned it really, but you know, he had gone. A huge pool table, which was very useful to a bunch of kids that were starving. But we were lucky. There was we had a kinds of shop department in the previous location, and did some fairly good teachers. And they loaded all the tools they could carry into some kind of a van, and they headed south while we were on the train. And they drove that thing. It took them a few days because the roads were all crowded, getting away from the Germans. When they arrived, this fellow Boris, who was basically a Russian, but he was a good teacher and a very handy man. He put the older boys that do some handicrafts to work. He got wood and built benches and tables and bunks for us to sleep on. And within a couple of months, you know, we had fairly decent operation. And then the pool table served as a very handy thing from which to have religious services. Oh yes, they did bring a Torah. We had a Torah in a previous home. They brought the Torah with them, which was a wonderful thing to have because it gave us the continuity. And this is where we lived, where they had the chestnut trees, and the older boys gathered wood for the older girls. There's a little romance going on every once in a while. And until a year later, some of us got picked to be on that first group to leave France. And there was like 4 or 5 homes like that. And we got out of there. Yes, Will, thank you. This is the SS Musino. After we traveled through Spain, Portugal, waited, this little ship arrived, 10,000 tons, and we were loaded into the cargo hold where they had put up temporary bunks. Now, this is a big business for shipping companies out of Lisbon, private shipping companies that were usually in the South America trade, carrying goods back and forth from South America to Lisbon and some of the Spanish or Portuguese-speaking countries down there. And they were carrying a lot of refugees. We were in a hold, about 4 high, just like a troop ship. And it taught us an awful lot of humility by the time we got to the United States. After going through these homes in France, after living off the land in Château-Montantin, the big abandoned chateau, and then being on this ship, which took about 12 days. Nowadays they do it in 7. And then it was only later that I found out there was a number of ships like this that made that trip. Like obviously this fellow that I mentioned before, Michael Chabon, when he wrote that book about his Cavalier's kid brother being in Lisbon waiting for a ship, and they finally got out and the Germans torpedoed it. But we were lucky, we did see some more ships in the distance, but we weren't bothered. It was a Portuguese ship, there was a number of them. And it's funny, at this time in my life, just within the last year, I'm getting emails from people asking for directions. And I wonder if you could still talk to. A woman in Massachusetts sent me an email. I don't know where she got my email address. Her grandmother came over on a ship from Lisbon. Do I have any idea if I might have been on the same ship? And what was it like to be in Lisbon and then getting on a ship and come to the United States? So I gave her a couple of paragraphs, and I didn't know the ship name didn't mean anything to me. It was another one. I knew there was another ship that was about 2 months behind us, who had a group of our kids from Montantin that we were reunited with later. But people are still interested, wanting to find out this history. There's a college girl in Vienna who wrote me a letter. I understand you were a good friend of Oswald Kernberg. Oh, we are living in the apartment that his family occupied before the war, before they were deported. Can you tell me a little bit about him? Well, Oswald Kernberg later became Art Kern, who was one of my best friends in Los Angeles as well as in France, same age as I am, a couple of months apart. Art died 2 years ago. He had leukemia. He was another scientist. He worked for North American Aviation out in Simi Valley, where they were testing rocket engines at the beginning. He was on TV a couple of times demonstrating how they count down on the test site. I don't know if anybody familiar with Simi Valley, California, North American Aviation. I don't know if they still do or not, but that's where they were testing the rocket engines, and Art was one of the engineers on the job. So he was another one that they could have used the talent and brains of what we have. I'm just a minor player in this whole thing. I mean, I can ride a little bit. So anyhow, this was the Musino. This was the ship on which we came across the Atlantic Ocean and finally arrived on Staten Island on June 21st, 1941. That's when I say, that's when my life began. That was me when I got there, terribly undernourished, boils all over my body. People that wanted to have me, they had foster homes. They wouldn't accept me. A lot of them didn't. I felt like I was on one of those slave auction blocks in the old South. Take your shirt off, turn around, let me see, what's wrong with you? Well, it was from undernourishment that we were completely, everybody had their different problem. But it was me the day I arrived. And my uncle Gustav was the one who took that picture. That wasn't Shabbos, it was a Saturday morning. Now, funny thing, you know, we were still pretty religious kids. Those of us that were Orthodox on that ship, we had a meeting. We can't get off the ship on Shabbos and get on a bus and be driven. That's a sin. We can't stay on the boat, they won't let us stay here. So we decided, well, we better get off. So we got on the bus and they took us into Manhattan, to some facility. Well, as the ship was pulling into the dock, I recognized my uncle and his wife standing on the dock, waving to me. Somebody had notified them, probably an aunt back in France, that I was going to be on that ship and ride. Do you know what my first thought was? Poor misguided little kid that I was. Oh my God, Uncle must have taken a ride in order to get here. He wrote on Shabbos and he wasn't supposed to ride. I was still an Orthodox kid. Funniest thing happened. Once I got into the foster homes, all I heard was, "You're in America now. That's old country. You could work." I was working for a guy on Lawrence Avenue in Chicago, delivering groceries. It got dark on Friday evening. I said, "It's Shabbos, I gotta go." He looks at me, he says, "I'm as good a Jew as you are, and if I keep my business open to make a living, you can stay here and deliver the groceries." How can I, as a 14-year-old, argue with this man? Anyhow, that's what I looked like. And there was some relatives that greeted me eventually in Chicago. By the way, I arrived 2 weeks before my bar mitzvah. All across, I had a Chumash, Bible with me. Those of you who know what a Chumash is. And I was studied under the influence of one of the older boys. His name, German, Anselm Hirsch. He later changed it to Asher Hirsch. He became a rabbi, very educated, very devout Jew. His father was a dentist in Frankfurt. His father was also a Mohel. I have to explain that. He is the one that performed the ceremonial circumcisions on little boys. And he probably did me, because we didn't have anybody in that little village where he made the rounds. So I came to Los Angeles years later, and there was a woman, Rosie Miller, Rosie, anyhow, she was married to a guy that owned an electrical company, and it turned out she was the sister of this fellow, Gersh. And she says, "Oh," she says, "my father probably did you." So I says, "I don't know, give me the story." And this is, coincidences in this world are so funny. She got into politics in Corona, California, and was on the city council. And they had a rotating city council who eventually became her turn. She became mayor of Corona, California. Her son became a police officer and eventually police chief. And I got to thinking, if I got stopped by a cop in Corona, California, I could tell him, "Don't touch me, your grandfather did it already." Any more? No?
Another?
A few pictures. There was my sister, what she looked like before she got deported. And this is the house, the way it looked when we first got there. Let's see, what else we got? Oh, yes. Corporal Greene. I was drafted into the Army in 1950. And would you believe it? I was put into the 43rd Infantry Division, sent to Germany. And I was sent to radio school. I became a radio operator. I was in communications. And I spent more time interpreting court-martials, investigations. Every time some German farmer had a beef because some tank left a rut in his field, we had to go after and pacify him. And it was a fun thing to do. And at that time, in Germany, uniformed personnel of the United States Army could get on any train without ticket, without question, first-class compartment, just go anywhere you want. So I went, every time I had time off, I got on the train, and of course visited Hallstein. Then I walked in, and somebody recognized me. Are you Eric? I said, yes. Oh, we were so good to your parents. Then first thing you know, people gathered. Oh, we were all friends of your parents. We used to bring them food in the dead of night because they weren't allowed to buy any. And would you believe how good your parents were being treated? And the dirty Nazis came from outside and deported them. And I went into the house that had belonged to us, and the woman that, she was the mother of the, I don't know, mother or wife, whoever took over the house that was given to them, they had no choice. She got on her knees and grabbed me around the legs and says, please, please don't repossess this house. This is our home now. I says, I have no intention of living in this place again. But if there's any money that ever comes, it will be collected by the proper agencies. I don't want to get started, I just want to take a look. So I went through the house and took pictures of all the homes and of all the rooms. And then I went out and, and everybody wanted to buy me coffee, and everybody was telling me about how hard it was during the war. Everybody fought the Russians. Nobody fought the Americans. Nobody. You talked to, he died, my son died on the Russian front. Oh, yes, we fought the Russians. The Russians were the enemy. The Americans, we knew eventually the Americans would become our friend. So, I'll tell you, how am I doing here? Taking time away from people. But it occurred to me at the time, I'm an American soldier, a few years after the war, wandering through Germany. I had no weapon. I never gave it a thought. I guess I could have carried a sidearm, but I didn't. I didn't want to. They felt so natural. Oh yeah, it's wonderful. Oh, you speak German, it's great. Woman on the train, I'm in the compartment. She heard me talking to the conductor. Then she said, oh, you speak German. Oh, that's so nice. You must admit, the German was still a better soldier, wasn't he? I says, who won the war? General. I was a corporal. I had a couple of stripes. I don't know if she knew what that meant. But I had as many gewgaws on me, insignia, impressed them. They get impressed by stuff like that. Anyhow, I walked into Hallstein, and I took the train up there. It was still running. And everybody was telling me about how they only fought the Russians. There was one guy that admitted that he didn't fight the Russians. He was a radio operator in Norway, strictly a non-combatant. Okay, I believe you, whatever. But it's the way they turned, and they do not admit that there could have been anything wrong. Of course, now there are people like the Luptons who actually come from England, nice couple over here, who put these remembering stones out onto the streets where the Jews used to live. Now, there are some cities, but before they didn't do it. Munich is one. Munich will not have the cobblestones, or Stolperstein as they're called, the cobblestones placed. Munich has a commemorative museum and a plaque with the names, as far as I know. Frankfurt, as far as last count I heard, Frankfurt has 1,100 of them placed out throughout the city where people used to live. Have I got any more pictures? Oh, that was me. I was working for the railroad in Chicago when I got drafted, and I took the liberty of riding in a cab on our troop trains when we were going from one place to another, transferring, going out to the artillery range. And that is the little thing I was talking about, the certificate in place of passport that's set across the top for emigrating to France, strictly as a exit visa. That's what it amounted to, with the big J on the part. That's the front on the right side.
I think that may be it.
Huh? One
That
more.
may be the last one.
No, that's it? No?
Doesn't
One
seem
more?
to want to go more.
I thought it was the end. I thought there was another one.
No.
Okay. Well, that's the story of my life as much as it is the story of what happens to the Jews in Germany. It was a brutal, planned, scientifically organized way of exterminating 6 million people. There were other similar happenings throughout history, but never in that cold-hearted, measured manner, taking 4,000 people a day through gas chambers. They had 3 gas chambers. If they had taken all that money, all that talent, all that effort, and put it to the war effort, instead of persecuting the Jews. If they had left the Jews alone, who were patriotic Germans, many of us, we could have contributed to the war effort, and they probably would have won the war. There might not have been a war, but they caused it to happen, and it happened. And now, here in Germany, they act like they won the war. Everything is so much better in Germany. I don't want to get into that. There's too many people that, when they come to the United States, say, oh, it's not as good as this back home. Any questions? I'll be here if you want to comment. Anybody else want to get into this thing?